Hi, Anna.
Hi, Alice.
I am going to test some screen sharing real quick. So let me
Yeah,
know.
no worries.
I'm going to try. Do you now see this as full screen?
No, I don't see anything at the moment.
Oh, wait, sorry. Need to actually hit share.
Yeah, that's perfect. I see the full screen. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, all works.
Great.
I just quickly wanted to ask, how did your poster session go? Because I tried to follow the link to your room, but it didn't seem to work.
Yeah, so it seemed like there was a broken link if you went from the
website.
If you went under the posters tab on the website, the link didn't work. If you went under the agenda tab, it did. And we couldn't get it fixed in time. I didn't discover that until the first, or like 2 minutes before the poster session.
Okay.
So we did have 25 people there. So it was pretty good turnout. We had good discussion for about 20 minutes, and then things kind of fizzled. But otherwise, I think it was a moderate success.
That's good. Can I just quickly check with you as well, because I'm supposed to be moderating one of the sessions tomorrow, and I haven't received any instructions on like how to log in as a moderator. Who can I contact about that?
So if you're listed as a moderator, you don't need to do any logging in or anything. You just need to say like, "Hi, welcome to the poster session," and then what I did was I shared my screen and I just opened up each of the PDF posters in a tab, so that they could just present from my screen rather than having to switch screen shares every time.
Sure. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing that you might want to do is think about a couple of discussion questions to get things started. My room was pretty quiet initially.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Hey Alice,
Hi.
Did you end up kind of breaking out in breakout rooms on the fly by deciding like how many people in each room on the fly?
Yes. So we actually, well, I don't entirely know what the chat moderator did, but it was just instantly we were in breakout rooms. And I don't remember if the setting, since I actually, could you? You're not listed as host either.
I'm not.
I think there was an email that had host information.
Yes.
About logging in for that. Because we do need somebody to have host privileges so that they can. Would you mind signing out and signing back in with the host login? I will, forward you right now the email that has the information for that.
It's that Google sheet, right?
Yes.
Okay. I will be right back.
All right, thank you.
Another technical question, Alice. Do you know
Yes.
whether we can like extract the whole list of participants rather than manually type them down from the session now?
That is a good question.
Or do we even want to do that, need to do that?
I mean, it would be nice to have, I think, but
maybe if we can just ask people to introduce themselves in the chat, that would be easier to copy because some of them appear with like not the full names.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we did this morning. It was much easier.
Yeah, I'll just have everyone introduce themselves in the chat.
Thanks.
Olivia, it looks like you have host privileges now.
You need me to add you as a co-host?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second Working Group 1 session of the AOS Online 2020. I imagine we'll have some people joining us over the next several minutes. This morning's session got about, I think it was about 30 people. So I imagine we'll have a few more that join us. But we'll go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to have Olivia, as the chat manager, read our standard set of opening instructions.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to read our script. The circumpolar Arctic is a contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous people and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in open-minded community building collaboration as described by the ASSW Code of Conduct, which I will now share in the chat window. There's a couple of logistics. We are all going to start out with our cameras off and audio muted. If you are willing to unmute yourself at any time, please remember to remute after you're done speaking. If you're only calling in on the phone, please press *6 if you don't have a dedicated mute button. We do request you to keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking, because we can hear your typing in conversations and an echo potentially if you're not on mute. You can see there are controls on the Zoom by hovering your mouse at the bottom of the screen. We encourage you to use chat to also communicate with other participants, and I will be monitoring the chat box as well if you prefer to communicate in that way. If you need help, please message the moderator via the chat tool or the raise hand tool, which you can also find at the bottom of your screen. And also this presentation will be recorded and it will be posted on the AOS 2020 website. Back to you, Alice.
Thanks. First off, rather than going around and everyone doing introductions out loud, if you could please introduce yourself in the chat box, just name where you're from, very, very briefly what you're interested in, so that we have a record of who's participating in this meeting. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started on our short introduction. So this is Working Group 1. We are the Design, Optimization, and Implementation of the Observing System Working Group. This is Arctic Observing Summit Day 1. If it feels like we're on Day 4 by now, welcome to the club. So I guess we've already gone through the chat monitor introduction, but to give our our agenda for this morning, we're going to start with an introduction to the AOS, the Working Group 1 within the AOS, and how it relates to SAON and this new ROADS process. We'll have a very brief presentation from Hank Loescher in this related to how we're thinking about these problems of design and implementation of an observing system, cover Working Group 1 goals for the whole summit. And then we're going to go into a couple of presentations from different observing system organizations and how they approach these questions. We'll have brief open discussion followed by splitting into breakout groups where we'll have discussion questions guiding this around what challenges and opportunities there are for implementing a structured model like these in the Arctic system. We'll come back after a short break to share out for a whole group discussion, come up with any recommendations, and then we'll introduce Day 2 activities and some homework questions. So if at any point you have questions or would like to say something, feel free to either just unmute yourself and chime in, or you can use the raise hand option or put it right in the chat box. So today, we're really focusing on this question of evaluating structured models. I apologize that I'm using slides from this morning's sessions that are still naming Roberta as the chair of everything. So Roberta, you're off the hook here. We'll be working through these activities to kind of get at recommendations surrounding these structured models. So for context and looking through the list of names on this call, many of you are familiar with these organizations, but in case you need a refresher, the SAON organization, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, is a joint initiative of the Arctic Council and IASC, and it is there to engage producers and end users of observations around the Arctic system. The Arctic Observing Summit, where you're at right now, is a task under SAON, and this is really meant to be a bottom-up, community-driven and science-based tool for gathering input into SAON processes and SAON strategy. So that's what we are doing today with the Arctic Observing Summit, is facilitating these discussions in order to gather input into this process. So SAON's plan and approach for implementing a kind of cohesive Arctic observing system is called the Roadmap for Arctic Observing and Data Systems, abbreviated as ROADS. So to clarify, in case you haven't already watched Sandy's keynote, ROADS has nothing to do with actual physical drive on them roads, but rather is it's meant to be a structure around which different communities who are relevant to Arctic observing, either as producers of data or as end users, can engage with this one single strategy, can start to speak a common language, and be able to share resources and strategies across sectors. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Hank to introduce the systems engineering approach in the ROADS concept.
Thank you so much, Alice. And welcome everyone to this working group session. And I'm not too sure if this is sort of a system engineering talk or not, but the idea is that we are still trying to move towards a design, a concept for an Arctic observing system, and it's really important for everyone to have a voice in that process and to contribute. And so today we'll be having some breakout sessions again on what kind of models that might have worked, what kind of lessons learned, what kind of approaches, and then tomorrow we've got some other guided breakout sessions on trying to figure out what those requirements or design elements would look like in terms of an Arctic essential variable. And so if you're looking at this graph here, right now we've got on the left-hand side lots of different activities, lots of observation efforts, some very comprehensive, other ones less so, and we haven't really identified what those gaps are. And what we're trying to do in these two sessions, today and tomorrow, is to move that process to the right, to be able to start capturing information that'll lead towards us being able to figure out, us being collectively, a design or a structure for an Arctic observing system. And so what we're really doing here is trying to put some process to that in being able to capture both the observational models that may work in lessons learned, as well as some detail of how you would define what an essential Arctic variable would be. So on the next slide, oh, I didn't know that. In terms of the ROADS process and some guidance principles that we're looking embracing, is that what we should be thinking about are things that are complementing the integration that are through current planning approaches and existing observing networks, and to think about what we're doing in a very stepwise fashion. So if you see the image on the right, in starting from an essential variable, being able to identify what that is, where that is, why an essential variable is potentially chosen by your breakout group, how it contributes to a societal benefit area, and what are those potential applications. And we've got another slide that sort of shows how we might want to be mapping all of that together. Here, the concept then of an essential Arctic variable is a broad phenomenon, something that can contribute to a variety of different disciplines, approaches, and information. And it's that structured interface that can be identified, can map to and describe what an Arctic societal benefit would be, being able to define that in terms of system requirements, where it needs to be observed, how it needs to be observed, if it's being observed, and then how to implement that, where we're actually going to operate that or integrate that in a broader federated Arctic observing system. Next slide. And this is an essential variable sort of map and framework for ocean observing, a fairly straightforward and simple one. If we're able to get something like this by the end of the workshop, that would be really super, thinking about an end goal. But ultimately, we would be trying to be able to take a look at how to map, in this case, an essential variable of sea ice, being able to then map that to the left of what kind of applications, what kind of data products, what kind of science areas that can be addressed by that variable, and then mapping that farther to the left of what are the actual benefits to society that can be derived in terms of, in this case, food security and livelihoods. And then if we're then starting again in the middle where that variable is, being able to identify to the right where that is being observed, how that's being observed, if it's being observed, and how that is integrated into different types of data networks and or the availability of those data.
Thank you. So for today, we are really focusing on one of the two information areas that SAON through the ROADS process has asked us for. So over the course of the Arctic Observing Summit, Working Group 1 will be addressing both of these two things. The first being assessing impactful essential Arctic variables, figuring out what it means for something to be an essential Arctic variable, and then linking those to the societal benefit areas and relevant design requirements for the observing system around those. The second area, and that's actually where we're focusing today, so we're kind of doing this in reverse order, is to think about structured models or schema to document and to build out these relationships between essential Arctic variables, observation requirements, observational systems, and then the societal benefit areas and the potential use cases. So we're going to start again today by having a couple of short presentations from organizations that are already working on organizing Arctic data in various ways. And then we'll move into a period of time for open contributions and comments related to these. So Jari, would you like to share from your screen, or I can pull up your presentation on mine?
Yeah, I can share my screen if it's possible.
Okay, I will stop mine and go right ahead.
No. Could you see now?
Yes, however, the group chat and the participant list are right in the front.
Yeah. This one. Full screen. Now, maybe.
There you go.
Or presentation mode. Present, maybe. Now it's better.
Perfect.
All right. So I'm talking a little bit about the GOOS, Global Ocean Observing System. So for the GOOS is aimed for the producing observation for the three topics. It's for the climate research, for operational oceanography, and ecosystem health monitoring. So the GOOS is an official system. So it's owned by the IOC and the Intergovernmental Oceanographical Commission, which is like a little brother of the WMO. And the World Ocean has divided with the 30 regional seas called the Regional GOOS Alliances. Basically, all globe is divided for these globe regional alliances, but not for the Arctic. And this is the very strange thing. Because there is a need, if you're looking about the white papers, for example, for AOS, and for the previous years, there has been many suggestions of having a GOOS for the Arctic. But in order to have a really GOOS regional alliance, that has to be agreed on IOC. And IOC is a really official body. So countries are voting about the establishing on everything. And it has been, frankly speaking, there has been a few countries which has been against of the Arctic rules. But then in a way, this is something similar. We have a Southern Ocean observing system. It is not the official GOOS regional alliance, but they have during the last years overcome about these things, and they have done it very, very good collaboration. So I think everybody should visit tape pages and look about the examples. For the management system, so I just wanted to show this slide for you, because we can start about it if you're talking about the global ocean system. So this is the GOOS is just office. So they don't have any money and they don't have any assets. They don't own any instrument. It's a pure management. There are pure people which are doing the coordination. And same is for the EuroGOOS. EuroGOOS is also, it's like a European coordination office for all the European activities. The EuroGOOS is a legal entity, so they can gain money. So they can run the project, they get external funding, but they are not doing any kind of observation themselves. All the activities for the Arctic, North Sea, Baltic, Iberian area, and Mediterranean Sea are done it in a regional ROADS. And these are very active. All activities happening here. So they, for example, in North Sea, there is maybe 30 partners every institute. So the reason why these nodes, regional bodies are active is that they are really research institutes which have a long-term mandate to conduct the measurements, long-term mandate to be responsible for operational services. They get funding from the ministerials or from soft money from European Union or national funding agencies. New thing in Europe is that we have started to merge about the national research infrastructures together. One is the EuroArgo, this is the infrastructure focusing on maintaining Argos in Europe. Then we have some GERICONEX, this is for the coastal observatories. EMSO, ERIC, this is for the deep sea monitoring. And then the fixed platforms for like classical mooring platforms. And these research infrastructures, they could get the funding directly from the partners institutes, research institute, but also they could get the funding from the European Union to fund research infrastructures. For the Arctic, we don't have anything. For the Arctic, we have projects like in TARAS, but nothing such sustainable like in other seas. As an example of the GOOS federated observations is Argo. Everybody, I think you have known about the Argo, It has been revolutionized the ocean observations. But during the last years, we have more and more Argos also in the Arctic, in the seasonal ice zone. So there are European activities and US activities using the Argos and even under ice. There's a specific software, ice avoiding software, which Argos can work, do the measurements under the ice and then send it data via satellites when there's ice-free conditions. But real Argos for the Arctic are ice data platforms. And this is the real research institutes now responsible for that one. It's semi-permanent monitoring activities. But this is like a two networks which should be combined sometimes in the future. Then a couple of slides about the essential sea ice and ocean variables. And the GOOS, it was quite interesting that when the GOOS was, just in this meeting, I think we should come on list at less than 10 Arctic essential variables. But if you look at, for example, the list of the GOOS essential variables for the ocean, I think there are 20 or more variables for physics, chemistry, and biology. And then therefore sea ice, that's one variable for sea ice. But we know that there cannot be one variable for sea ice, because the sea ice, can be quantified as a concentration, as extent, as a thickness or drift. And these are WMO, Global Climate Observing System, sea ice, essential climate variables. Then I know that there are some action about the SCORE group, but they are looking for much more sea ice variables. And then we saw that in the previous presentation also that there's like a coastal fast ice. That could be one of the essential climate variables. So I'm really excited about this kind of discussion. What kind of conclusion, how we end after the few days, so what is the essential climate variables for the Arctic? This is a little bit that similar figure what we saw in the introductory presentation. This is again from the GOOS. If you look about they have one parameter here as a sea ice. Then we can study about from the left side about the themes, so the climate, operational services, ocean health. And this is the social benefits, like climate mitigation. We have had also food security, which is the topic of our meeting. Then we have here in this side how to observe. For sea ice is observed by the satellites or drifting buoys. Then it's about the networks. I really didn't find any kind of Arctic network here, but I think for Arctic we have a very strong contribution for individual scientists, universities, institutes, and so on. Then we have like a GOOS doing something for integration activities and USIUs. But then for data networks, I'm not know all of these agro-GOOS, but I think no one of those are really the Arctic related thing. Then my final slide, as I said, that there is a strong need to establish ArcticGOOS. And as I said, that there has been a discussion in IOC, but because it's a political, it seems it's not possible to establish an ArcticGOOS now or during the next few years. But I just make like a 5 bullet points how we can do the progress toward for the ArcticGOOS. So first, it's very important that every nation integrate Arctic Ocean monitoring nationally. So in Finland, Norway, in US, and Canada, have something like a national committee, national club, national network for Arctic Ocean monitoring. Very important is that they add open data policy and build on trust within the institutes and within people, that nobody is not storing your data, but you can really you benefit of the opening your data sources. I think that this is something what we can do very quickly, that make a partnership between national and regional networks, US, Canadian, European, and other activities, POGO, FAAS. I noticed that there was a white papers about from these groups. And then if we have any kind of partnership for the ArcticGOOS, then we can promote benefits of ArcticGOOS for those countries which are not really favoring for the ArcticGOOS, and maybe we could have really a mandate from a blessing from the GOOS office and establish an ArcticGOOS. And again, I would just say that we should really look what kind of developments they had done it in Southern Ocean. This is the example now for the zoos. So this is the zoos maps. One can harvest all the observation. One can look about what is the ocean observations conducted with the different instruments. And all this data is coming from the open data sources. So I think that there's not so big things to establish such kind of things what they have for the zoos, but it's more like putting things together. Thank you very much. I think this is my 7 minutes. I don't know how much I used. Hopefully didn't talk too long.
No, that's perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
Thanks.
So we'll go ahead and hear next from Tom Christensen with the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. Tom, can you share your slides?
Yes, I'm here. So I should just share screen or what, and then
Yes.
go through. Yeah. Okay. I'll do that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can you see my screen here?
Not yet. You'll probably need to hit share.
Share.
In the lower
there.
right. Yes.
So there it is. You see it now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm afraid my internet connection is not too good, so I'm not sharing my webcam also. But I hope you can all hear me. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry, I had some technical problems in the beginning, so I didn't hear the first presentations. I heard hi Joan right now, but I didn't hear the first presentations. But I'm gonna do a short presentation about the ecosystem and biodiversity monitoring program in the Arctic, in Arctic Council. It's called the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, and it's the monitoring program under the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, and I'll come back to that in a second. I'm the co-chair of the program together with Kathy Kuhn, who is actually right now doing a presentation in another session at the same time here. Many on this meeting here is probably familiar with Arctic Council and maybe also about the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. The CAF working group, the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, is the biodiversity working group in Arctic Council. And it's organized as the same way as the Arctic Council as such. There is a board in CAF consisting of the 8 Arctic countries and also the 6 indigenous organizations. There are also observer countries from non-Arctic countries taking part of the CAF board meetings. And the mandate for CAF is to address the conservation of Arctic biodiversity and to communicate the findings to governments and residents with the focus of the Arctic. And the overall goal is then to practice and ensure the sustainability of the Arctic living resources. So that's the overall goal of the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. So the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, that's the so-called biodiversity monitoring program under CAF or under Arctic Council. So I'll come a little bit back to the organization that we're dealing with, and I think the organization is quite interesting in relation to the discussion that we can have here later on, because there is a strict line for this monitoring program and then up to the different agencies in the Arctic country, and that's a strength for I think for our monitoring program. So. But the monitoring program as such is a big network of existing networks. And the purpose is to improve the detection and understanding and reporting on Arctic biodiversity trends and ecosystem trends. We have 4 monitoring plans developed in CBMP. We have one for marine, one for freshwater, one for terrestrial, and one for the coastal ecosystems. And then we have the whole CBMP guided by a strategic plan, and I'll come back to that in the following slides as well. And I would say that the main products from the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program is our State of Arctic Biodiversity reports. These are the major outputs, and I'm showing a little bit about that in my next slides as well. If we start with, as I mentioned, there are 4 monitoring plans in CBMP. So if we start with the concept of how these monitoring plans are developed, I'll go through this short presentation here on how these are developed. We call them adaptive, the monitoring plans. We call them adaptive and ecosystem based. So in each of these 4 groups, in each of the 4 monitoring groups in CBMP, we have developed, as you see on the picture on the right in the middle, we have developed some conceptual ecosystem models. And we have tried in these models to identify the focal ecosystem components. And these focal ecosystem components, they are actually what we're reporting on in CBMP. And we have developed the models and the focal ecosystem components based on the management questions that we are asked in the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program by these agencies and observers, and also by the permanent participants and indigenous organizations that are in the Arctic Council. So each of these would have some questions to us, and then based on these questions, we try to identify the focal ecosystem components that would then serve as indicators for the ecosystems and for the biodiversity. It sounds easy, but it's not an easy task to have. So when you bring a lot of scientists together in a room and you ask them what are then the most important questions and what are the essential ecosystem components, there would be different answers. So that's an exercise that takes time, but it actually comes back to you again. When we have this in place, we have designed our monitoring program. And as I said, it's based on science, but also on input from indigenous knowledge holders. And then we start collecting the data, doing the analysis, and then we do our reportings. And as you see here on the left side, we have the State of the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Report, which was the first assessment we made in the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. These type of reports, they consist of, or they contain main concludings, key findings, but they also include advice on next steps in CBMP. So what were the gaps in the monitoring, and what monitoring, what advice do we have to future monitoring? So we bring that back to the CAF board, and then based on the advice and new knowledge, the new knowledge we have, but also the marine monitoring, for instance, is back from 2011. So during these 10 years, we also have new technologies, new methods we can use. So based on that, we have had scoping workshops to adjust the design of our monitoring program. So it's a long-term monitoring program, but it's also ecosystem based, and this loop that you see here is why we also call it adaptive. So the structure in CBMP right now is, as you see here, it's the CAF board in the middle, and then we have the co-chairs of CBMP, where Kathy Kuhn from US and me are the co-leads. And we form a technical team with the CAF secretariat, and then we have the 4 steering groups: the terrestrial, the freshwater, coastal, and the marine steering groups. We have the 4 monitoring plans, and now we have also the first products. You see the State of the Arctic Marine Biodiversity, a freshwater State of the Arctic Biodiversity report. If you want to see these reports, I can send you the links to the reports. And for the terrestrial group, we also are just about to finalize our State of the Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Report. And we have recently made a special journal issue that will form the platform for the State of the Arctic Terrestrial Report. It consists of 14 journal articles, I think it is, with different topics. So there's a lot of information on a scientific level on the focal ecosystem components that we want to report on. It's the whole program is supported by scientific publications as well. And as I said, at the bottom here, you see the strategic plan for CBMP. We have a 4-year strategic plan, and we're just about to revise it and make a new strategic plan, and this plan guides the whole CBMP. On the bottom right on this figure here, you see the actions for Arctic biodiversity. These actions are the CAF priorities for their period, and this action plan goes from 2013 to 2021. And this action plan also contains a lot of actions that the CAF board want to focus on, that the 8 Arctic countries want to focus on. And it also contains a lot of goals in relation to the monitoring and reporting. So we take these actions into account when we make the strategic plan for CBMP as well. I just want to go a little bit back to the State of the Arctic Biodiversity reports, because these are the main products for the whole monitoring programs. We have, as I said, now the State of the Arctic Marine Biodiversity report, as well as the freshwater. Soon will come also the terrestrial, and after the terrestrial, we'll have the coastal assessment. So in these assessments here, we have information about existing monitoring programs and what these programs are able to say about changes in Arctic biodiversity and ecosystems. It provides key trends on biodiversity and these central ecosystem components or variables, as you could also say, or call them ecosystem variables. And then, as I said, advice for future monitoring. And all these key findings and advice are directed towards the policy and decision makers. And the Conservation of Arctic Flora, the Working Group of Arctic Council, help us communicate this also. But it also, as I said, it also includes information from indigenous knowledge holders. We haven't been as good at this as we wanted to. But for instance, now the coastal monitoring plan that we have developed most recently contain a very strong input from indigenous organizations and traditional knowledge holders as well. And we have a lot of as I said, focal ecosystem components in our program, and these focal ecosystem components are monitored through different ways. One way in the coastal plan is to also, for instance, include taste as an indicator. These different species, they taste different depending on, for instance, what they eat. So we've been told by the indigenous knowledge holders or traditional knowledge holders that this is also an indicator on the status of, for instance, the species. So this is just an example. I was asked to come with examples on how this program could also increase food security in the Arctic. We haven't been very good at it so far. It's been mainly based on scientific information, but we are starting now also to be better to include other aspects as well, like the example I just gave here. There's more information on the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service. The link is here. And we have a lot of other communication tools, and you are welcome to try to see these different tools. And that was all from me. So I don't know if we take the questions here or if we take them later.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll do one more talk, and then we'll have a brief period of time for questions for everyone.
Okay.
Olivia, would you like to share your screen, or would you like me to put the slides up?
I'm going to give it a shot, Alice. Thank you.
Okay.
Tom, will you stop the screen sharing? Is that showing up at all?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right, great. So I'm presenting on behalf of my colleague, Finn Danielson. We recently created a new thematic network for the U-Arctic, focused on community-based monitoring with an emphasis on linkages between CBM and natural resource management. If you go on the U-Arctic's thematic network website pages, you'll find a little bit more information about our newly established thematic network. Again, you can see the different partner organizations that span across several different countries across the Arctic and subarctic, including Japan. But again, the goal for creating a network like this was to get a better linkage between CBM programs and natural resource managers, and also to link CBM programs across the Arctic so that we get an opportunity to learn from each other and how we can make CBM programs more useful for decision-making on the natural resource management. So our presentation is basically focused around answering some of the key questions that the organizers asked us to emphasize. So just briefly, CBM defined in our network as monitoring undertaken by local stakeholders in relation to aims that make sense to them. So in a sense, this bottom-up approach really ensures that whatever observing activity is getting done does have societal relevance to them. In general, a couple of steps that we think could help link a CBM network to this whole process of identifying essential Arctic variables is looking at some of the general variables that various Arctic CBM programs might be conducting across the Arctic, and list some of those that are common across them. And then having a process to allow discussions and iterations with community members, other CBM program practitioners, and civil society organizations, just so that there's an opportunity to refine what might be just a general common list of variables across programs. And of course, important to consider the principles of free and prior informed consent and the care principles for treatment of data, and emphasizing the ability to build capacity across CBM programs and providing support for those doing CBM monitoring. Again, because we feel that CBM programs are focused on local observing priorities, that's a really tight linkage between variables that are being collected, observations by communities, and how that links directly to societal benefits. In terms of thinking about how these local scale CBM programs might be connected to broader international programs, like the two previous presentations that had that strong international linkage. This is something that is still a work in progress for developing this thematic network. The first step obviously is to create those connections and collaboration opportunities for CBM programs that are interested in networking together. We haven't yet agreed on exactly what mechanism that might be to connect the various CBM programs, other than having occasional workshops and experiential exchange workshops, and focusing on those opportunities for collaboration, again, on capacity building and considering the issues related to data sovereignty. And then finally, when thinking about how we can link both the local scale observations and Pan-Arctic scale observations, we only had a couple of example suggestions, again, focused on natural resource management. And one is finding ways to better link the remote sensing data that across the Arctic, many research communities are contributing. A lot of this remote sensing data, including weather, waves, sea ice, could have direct relevance to societal interests, particularly for Indigenous communities living in coastal regions. But it's also important to keep in mind that the format of how these remote sensing data are presented is important. It should be easy to access and use by communities in order for it to really serve that societal benefit. And then also these large-scale biological surveys that are being done across the Arctic or focused regionally have direct relevance to how communities are thinking about their resources that may be moving across boundaries, across areas that they may typically be hunting in the present day, but maybe moving into the future. So just a real quick acknowledgement of our funding sources for the Start of our Thematic Network, and if there are any other questions, there's our contact info. And that's it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Olivia. So we have 13 minutes for a whole group discussion before we start breaking into discussion sections. So does anybody have questions for any of our three speakers? Or does anyone have comments related to other ways we might want to think about organizing observations and observing efforts? I'll start with a question actually for each of the three of you. Each of the approaches that you guys have been focusing on is a very good design for the type of data that you're used to working with. Do you see potential to scale into different sorts of observations? So whether the community-based monitoring projects could then have some way to integrate remote sensing or other measurements, or whether GOOS, say, would have capacity to scale that into incorporating community measurements. And whoever wants to can jump at that.
This is Sam Christensen here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, definitely. I think it's, we also in CBMP work with CBM. We haven't been so good at kind of organizing it, but a lot of scientists are actually using it. So I actually wondered if some of the things that you told about here could or may already be part of what we have information about. I'm not 100% sure, but definitely yes. I think there is a potential. It's scientists working in the field. They work for logistic reasons. It can be very expensive. And it can be very complicated. So the more we can use the different tools, the different ways to improve our different type of collections, the better. So I definitely think that there is an opportunity to develop it further, at least into the monitoring program that I'm representing.
Yari, did you want to go next?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question about the local measurements done it by the local people, and then the satellite observations which are global, and they are starting to integrate. So for example, if you're talking about the SAR satellite, so the pixel size of the SAR satellites are a few hundred meters, this is already possible. It's now already possible to make a service like a fast ice edge, and this is of course very, very important for all the local people. But then the community-based observation could give the added value. For example, like ice thickness or the snow thickness, something that I think that there could be a huge step forward if we can combine community-based in situ measurements and this new satellite product together and make a new product based on this satellite data and the in situ measurement by communities. And I think then I think also the local people think that kind of products and or their measurements are useful. Also, if those measurements are continued for the years and years, then the measurements are also important for the climate research. But I don't know why we have not done it yet. Any kind of things. Is it because of the lacking of the really seed money, or is it because there is not any institute which would like to commit for long-term basis for that kind of things? But I really think that it can be done it pretty easily.
And I agree with what both Tom and Jari mentioned. I think there just are not a whole lot of opportunities to link these local scale and pan-Arctic or global scale observing activities. I don't think those opportunities to connect and discuss and jointly build a program or a plan for prioritizing types of observations, that framework, I think, is something that we can hopefully build in forums like this. And then I'll mention, Tom, there's a question for you in the chat from Hayo. He asks, within CBMP and the biodiversity data reports, what is the rough relative proportion of government agencies, Arctic communities, university scientists for providing data and for using data?
It's absolutely, it's universities. So it's absolutely mainly scientific data. We have in our monitoring plan also described how we wanted to use indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, also community-based monitoring. But I think, as I think I mentioned before, that some of the I can come up with several examples actually where the scientists have included community-based monitoring in their data. But it's still kind of it's scientific methods that are used to do that. But as I said, we are now working on trying to include more and more traditional knowledge as well. So in the coastal monitoring plan, for instance, you will see that both in the question settings, but also in the way we want to collect data, we try to include more local observations in the different frameworks for collecting the science. For collecting the data. So, but it is a challenge, and it takes time, and it's also a capacity issue. It's a funding issue. So it's not an easy thing, but it's something that we are trying to get better at. But the two reports shown here, the freshwater report, the freshwater assessment, and the marine assessment, I would say it's mainly science or university data that goes into these reports. I don't know if that was an answer on your question, Hayo.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions or topics to throw into this discussion? Has anybody else worked with observing systems or observational groups that you think have done a pretty good job of integrating and organizing across different types of observations?
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Lisa Lotte from Aarhus University, same university as Tom, almost same department as Tom. Well, we're at least at the same campus. Well, we sent in a white paper on GEOS, which is Greenland Integrated Observing System. So it's a little bit it's a little bit a regional observation system. And I can give a very small presentation of it if you would like to.
Sure, yeah, we've got a few minutes still before we need to split into breakout sessions. So if you'd like to share your screen,
I just have very few slides I could show, just to say what it's about.
Yes.
How do I share it, like here?
There should be a button in the middle of your panel that says share screen, and then you pick which screen and hit share.
This one?
Yes, it's there.
I will enlarge it. No, well, maybe this is okay. And it's a new observation system in the way that it's an observation system which is doing or based on different existing observation systems. It's building on the observation system called PROMISE, which is a well-established program to monitor changes in the mass budget of the Greenland ice sheet. And then it's building on the Greenland Ecosystem Monitoring Program, which I believe is a part of the monitoring program that Tom actually just presented. And that was established in '95, and it's been going on for, more than 20 years, and it's covering more or less, and I can show it here. It consists on, oh, my internet connection is unstable, it says. Well, but anyway, it consists on several programs, a climate program, or climate basis program, we call it, GeoBasis and BioBasis, and a marine basis, and a glacial-basis program. And it's, I'll go back to this one. It's the core of this Greenland Integrated Observing System, but it's a collaboration between all universities and research institutes working in the Arctic from Denmark and Greenland. And that was it.
Great, thank you. So we have time for one more question. If anybody has anything they would like to say. Okay, so we'll go ahead and now split into breakout groups. So it looks like we've got about 20 people on this call. So we'll split into, let's say, 4 groups that we'll be talking through over the next 45 minutes or so. These questions related to how and what sort of recommendations we can make for a structured model. So we've seen some great examples of models of organizing observations across different observation types, across national boundaries, and across different actual observed variables. And so there's obviously some things that are working really well and some things that could use some help scaling up. So we will, we have 4 questions that we've put together for discussion. I'm going to copy the link into the chat box in a second if I can find the right tab. So we'll copy this link into the chat box so that everyone in a discussion group, you can open this up, you can see these questions, and then go ahead and take notes right in the Google Doc that we've shared. So you can share that back with us so we make sure we have a copy of your notes from the discussion afterwards. So we will report back or gather back up. You can ignore the times up here, but we'll gather back at 11:30 11:50 my time, which I believe is 40 minutes before the end of the session. And we will share out and discuss what we came up with then. But again, to reiterate, the goal here is to think about the challenges, the opportunities, and what might work for adapting these structured models to the Arctic environment, where again, we're working with a lot of different types of observations, a lot of different communities, and a lot of different nations. So Olivia, if you could go ahead and split people into breakout groups. We're going to recommend that you take a 10-minute break, stand up, stretch, get more coffee, whatever you need, then reconvene in 10 minutes. So at 45 of whatever hour it is where you're standing, to start this discussion. And then we'll take another short break right before we reconvene to report out. If for some reason you have problems in the discussion room that you're in, you can go ahead and press, there'll be a like flag host or signal for host button, and you can request help that way.
Hey, Alice, this is Hayo.
Yes.
Just quick question. I see now suddenly there's 16 participants here. You know, I'm just wondering whether, if I don't know whether some people might have just signed on for the presentation, so it might make sense to have slightly larger groups.
Yes, I agree.
Well,
let's change that to 3 rooms, Olivia, if it's not too late for that, and we'll have a slightly larger discussion groups.
Thank you.
Right. So everyone should be automatically moved into your discussion room. You'll have to hit like enter room, but that will pop up on your screen. So please check back in a few minutes and enter your room. All right, it looks like we've got everyone back into the room now. How many, Olivia, how many groups did we ultimately have?
We had 2 groups.
Okay, great. Then could we have someone from, I guess, the group that I was in start by reporting out on what we discussed?
This is Anna. I think I could start. We have spent quite a lot of time identifying problems and challenges, and I won't go through all of them because this is quite a big list. But in terms of solutions, I think the main thing that we focused on was sort of optimizing research efforts and trying to think, for example, how to take paired measurements, how to pair variables to take simultaneous measurements, and use opportunity of collaboration between different stakeholders, for example, using tourist ships to take measurements or observations of something as they go. Same applied to businesses and, for example, oil and gas, or even military. And yeah, we also talked about harmonization of methods, which is crucially important because the more data we get, the more important it is to have it collected and stored and shared in the same way that it is accessible and easy to use. And we have also talked about reanalysis data. So particularly for the Arctic, there are often cases when we don't have any baseline data really, but if we do, it could and should be used for interpolation and extrapolation to extend spatial coverage, because often we take on the measurements and observations in a few stations, but we really need to extend the coverage for the modeling purposes. Yeah, I think those are sort of main things that we were focusing on, and we had some practical examples from GOOS mainly. But yeah, we were thinking about what particular measurements could be paired and what particular parameters could be measured at the same time. Do you want to add anything, Alice?
I'm happy, but would anyone else in the group like to add anything?
I'm fine.
All right, then could we have somebody from the other group share what you guys talked about?
Were there? I guess I was in a group with a total of 7 people. I was a I was a moderator. Hazel was a rapporteur. I'd be happy to just briefly summarize the key takeaways and then have the other participants in the group chime in.
That would be great.
So why don't I do that? So we had a great group because we had Tom representing the CBMP. We had Roberta with expertise on cryonet. We had Martina with expertise in EU and broader Arctic efforts focused on conservation, marine protected areas. And then we had Olivia with the CBM background, and Hazel and myself. And the key takeaways were, one, that disciplinary separation is a key challenge. That was evident in part, maybe also in the GOOS presentation. What do we do about that? And CBMP, for example, suffers from that to some extent as well. Excuse me. Insofar as they're only focusing on biotic variables. What do we do about that? So the suggestion was that focusing or bringing together a group of CBMP, cryonet, and GOOS experts, as well as community-based monitoring experts and ICC, starting at the regional level or national level in some location with a specific focus on exploring different observation frameworks, essential variables, and starting to dip into the requirements would be a good way to cut across these disciplinary boundaries. There were some good examples put forward, such as the Arctic Council's Arctic Adaptation Action initiative that tried to be more comprehensive by using indicators derived from scenarios. There was recommendations on specific mechanisms on how such workshops can be more inclusive. And there was also recognition that we need to better define or understand and define the different user needs, which again requires this interaction that starts out from the regional, national level and then scales up from there. We had a bunch more sort of more specific thoughts, but I think I'll just leave it at that and open it up for anybody else who was part of our group to comment or add.
I think you did it very well, Hayo. It's Tom here.
Great, thanks. So then I think that's us, Alice.
Okay, great. So the numbers that you indicated, Hayo, that you were a group of 7 and we were a group of 6 for the most part. I understand we've had a bunch of people join us from the data working group. So for those of you who are new to this call, welcome. We've been in a breakout session for the last while, talking about kind of 4 key questions about structured models for how to organize and consolidate measurements and observing efforts, looking at particular challenges, what aspects work well, which aspects maybe not work so well, and then what solutions we could come up with. So we're at the stage of having just reported back out from these group discussions as to what was what we covered. And for the rest of the time, and it looks like we've got about 30 minutes left, the question really is, can we agree on any recommendations for a structured model of something that would come out of the ROADS process? So does anyone have any comments that they would like to add at this point? And feel free to either speak out loud or comment in the chat box. Pierre, if you would like to say something, go right ahead.
Right, thank you. So we just dropped in from another session, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating anything that was covered here. But so I work on a GOOS panel. I'm a member of the Biology and Ecosystems Essential Ocean Variables panel. And that's been a really interesting process. I also work with the essential biodiversity variables on the data side. And the EOV process, I think it was the right balance of infrastructure people, operations people, policy, and also science and more academic disciplines. So I think it would be really cool to sync up the models there in terms of developing the EAVs as part of the ROADS process. I think that would be very valuable to learn from each other. Of course, they're going to be different things, different communities, naturally. But that interoperation on the basis of design, I think would be a real asset, particularly because as part of the IOC UNESCO work that is happening to prepare for the UN Ocean Decade for ocean science, this system to federate best practices and to gather up best practice and common practice documents through a project, an EU project called CIRCUAPOLAR, we're trying to clone that into the Arctic region. Of course, adapting it to the very unique needs there. So I think there's a chance there because we were able to get the EOV panels, or some of the EOV panels, to endorse methods that go into their specification sheets to help people then conduct those methods with a bit more stability out in the wild. So I think in terms of design principles, just like that early alignment and really deliberately saying where the strategy diverges and for what reasons, I think would be really, really awesome to see.
Thanks, and that was one of the big goals for today, was to evaluate or to look at a number of these models and how we can or where it makes sense to diverge from GOOS, where it makes sense to diverge from other models in place for different types of observations in different observing communities. Does anybody else have anything? So the big task that we have for the next 25 minutes is this question of, can we agree on any recommendations for the ROADS process? And I think the big thing that came out of our discussions in terms of that recommendation is that whatever form the model ultimately takes, it needs to include granularity down to measurement standards and kind of what it means to measure these certain variables in various ways. And part of that would be recommendations for pairing across disciplinary boundaries. So if you are a community observer looking at coastal sea ice, the recommended paired observations might also be wind conditions and or something about ocean, I don't know, making things up at this point. But the idea being that there would be guidance built into the system and into the structure on how an individual who doesn't necessarily, or an observing project who doesn't necessarily have the expertise across these disciplinary boundaries would be able to immediately know kind of where to look and what information to provide. Does that kind of parallel what you guys were thinking about with these disciplinary separation issues?
I can. I think I can speak for our group that that's a good representation of the problem, and you know, Tom can talk more about it. Tom Christensen, but he nicely laid out how, you know, CBMP has made progress on some of these issues, but they're now facing very specific challenges that our group felt can be addressed by bringing in other existing networks or frameworks for observing, you know, a CryoNet being a particular one, GOOS being another one, but then also making sure that community-based efforts are strongly represented, and shaping a, you know, a sort of a framework out of sort of a merging of those four different existing or semi-operable frameworks. I mean, so the way I interpreted our conversation was that it would be easier to arrive at a more holistic, cross-cutting framework by not starting from scratch, but rather trying to see whether you can merge or synthesize between different efforts that are maybe not very narrow, but still narrower than being sort of all-encompassing.
This is Will. Not to throw cold water on that. I think it's generally a good idea, but trying to merge those networks, you're talking about observations that are taken often at very different spatial and temporal scales, and so someone who's looking at ice is not the same scale as someone who's even looking at wind, right?
No, those are great points, Will. And actually, that did come up. I think Jari already mentioned this earlier. So the specific topic that we'd identified that these groups could coalesce around relates to the coastal, or that's where I need Tom's help now in a minute. But as I understand, CBMP is focusing on a coastal plan. So it would be a focus on the coast, where there is evidence that integration of satellite remote sensing resources, in situ observations, and community-based monitoring yield new information that's relevant in a number of different contexts. So we're not saying that we would merge all of these different observing networks, but rather we would go to a specific location or a particular region and take the approaches that those different networks or programs have developed and see whether those can be synthesized into something that has a that is on the one hand focused regionally, but at the same time is more cross-cutting than just measuring sea ice or just measuring ocean state and dynamics or just measuring biodiversity. And again, that's where the hope is that the Food Security Working Group is going to give us more ideas on how to implement that. But I don't know, Tom, Tom Christensen, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think, yeah, well, yes, a little bit maybe. I think, the comment we got here is absolutely correct. I agree with it. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we talked at the end of our discussion, also talked a little bit about who are the main users of the data and what are the main questions that we should answer. Because for instance, I think that I could, I have to be careful not to oversell CBMP, but I think actually in relation to the biodiversity and the biotic element, it is kind of a mini SAON. It is really, we do have a very strong network. We have an interdisciplinary group here talking about interdisciplinarity among the biotic elements. We need a lot of information also on the drivers and in relation to that, the abiotic elements, including wind and sea ice and so many other things. But I think a key is what are the main questions we would like to answer. And I think when we have these main questions or topics that we want to have more focus on, I think that's where we can actually bring people working with different disciplines together, and that's where it's relevant. And that could be food security, for instance, but it could also be status of some changes, some of the changes that we see in the variables that we want to measure. I don't know if that was kind of maybe made it a little bit more clear.
Yeah, it seems like there are a number of these kind of focusing questions that come up, and food security is an important one and probably a very long-lasting one. Indicators of climate change also being a similar topic. And so maybe the way forward is that we coalesce these kind of sets of networks around a limited set of questions, recognizing that the questions that are tackled first are not necessarily the only questions that should be tackled in this way. So where food security is our current focus, it can in some sense be a test case for this system.
Peter Pulsifer mentioned he had some comments to add too.
Yeah, I'll just briefly report back in relation to this working group from Working Group 4. And we've just wrapped up a couple of sessions. And during our sessions, we touched on a number of topics that I think are relevant here, including discussion of parameter standardization, various other vocabularies, documentation of variable-related data. The process that Will, I think, was alluding to as well with the synthesis and mediation or aggregation of data, repurposing and so on, what kind of tools are there, as well as engaging users and use cases and so on. So I think one of our key points that we'll be documenting in our statement is our need to be around, the same table. And so when you're thinking, I think about the disciplinary sort of inclusion and so on is potentially have a few data community representatives there, because we found ourselves saying, well, let's defer that conversation until we can sit down with Working Group 1. So we thought that was a good thing, and people like Pierre and others are involved in both sides, and we thought we just want to keep promoting that.
Thanks, Peter. Anybody else have any thoughts on this question?
Well, this is Bill Manley, University of Colorado. So I'd like to echo what Peter said. and that one of the recommendations, I think, for the ROADS process is to lean heavily on the knowledge, the lessons learned, the solutions, the awareness of the Arctic data community, particularly as it relates to semantics and controlled vocabularies.
Could you expand on what that would look like? Would it be things like, producing trainings or some sort of educational material on these shared vocabularies, or what do you have in mind?
Well, let's see. I'm not maybe the best person to address this, but one example is that there are existing vocabularies and glossaries and ontologies for things like essential variables. And it would be helpful to pick up, currently adopted or perhaps evolving, but established approaches towards interoperability at that level. But I think the main thing is that as part of the ROADS process, to have these two different communities, albeit with a lot of overlap, but these two different communities be together on the same working sessions, if you will, or documents or whatever, to work together. Yeah.
You have your hand raised.
Yeah, I could elaborate a little bit on that. So, it's a two-way process, because there will, of course, be data coming out of the system. And this whole semantic technology things, it's just a way for us to tell machines what that data is about. And the key thing about the sync I would anticipate between the design process is that we have to know what individual stakeholders see when they see certain words. So I work with the UN on the UN side, and of course, when you're working with the policy side, certain terms, they don't mean anything like the terms you would expect in a scientific discipline. And that's for a very good reason, of course. They have their own challenges to face. And so the key about syncing is to have the tech people listening in on these conversations, understanding what is actually being referred to, and translating that in a way that the machines understand too. So the right data is mobilized to the right stakeholder. So for the EOVs, for example, we're building that technology in a number of federations where a number of us are involved in. We made good progress there, but it's been a learning process on both sides. And I think that's something we have to cultivate in the Arctic, particularly because there are some very hyper-local issues that we need to think about.
Thank you. So do we have any further topics that we'd like to consider for recommendations? Sounds like we have some concrete ideas to move forward on representation and merging of existing systems, and then making sure that the data community is involved in that merging process.
Just coming from the food security working group yesterday, and I know this has somewhat been touched upon, but thinking about going cross-disciplinary, I think it's important to think about the fact that, and we kind of talked about this in our little breakout session, that the variables that we care about as scientists are not necessarily the variables that local communities care about. And so making sure that we carve out a space of these, essential observing variables that are important to the local communities as well, I think would be a good recommendation. Because, we can use their community-based observations, but at the same time, they can use our variables as well. So looking at it going both ways.
I think that's a great point, Kat, because that did come up in our working group as well. And that is that, or if you reflect on the presentation Olivia gave, there's evidence that community designed observing networks provide variables that have an impact in the context of management of resources or responding to rapidly changing environments. So that's one way to arrive at specific essential variables. Then another way to arrive at it is, over on the scientific side, where you say, well, we're interested in specific state variables or dynamic variables that we need in order to both describe and predict the state of the system. And then you have, and those two approaches right now, there's a major gap. That's something we discussed in our breakout group. But there are ways that you can cut across, either by drawing on things like participatory scenarios or other processes that allow groups of experts with very different backgrounds, including experts from these communities, to jointly co-define a key set of variables. And that process, I would propose, and it would be good to hear from others whether they agree or not, but that process requires more work. That may be something that would be something that has to rise to the level of recommendation, because currently we're not really good at doing that.
So the AOS mantra is all about being a bottom-up type process to gather community input into this, but it seems like one of the things that's emerging is that rather than having the entire community at the table, we need kind of key experts from different areas and different types of communities to be sitting at that table together. Is that a sense that others have gotten? I think we have a hand up from Pierre.
Yeah, sorry, I'm being quite so vocal, but it's a strange combination of worlds that I straddle here. So I think that's really a good point. There are expert panels which can kind of stabilize this a little bit, but one of the reasons that I joined the EOV panels for biodiversity is I complained a lot, because my boss at the Alfred Wegener Institute said, "Hey, can we use these?" And we're an Arctic and we're a polar institute. And I looked at the EOVs, and they had things like mangroves and stuff. And I'm like, well, not yet. Maybe in a few hundred years when we have mangroves up there, yes, we could use it. So then I started communicating with the EOV panel, and they said, hey, look, it's bottom up. If you need some Arctic stuff, come on in. And I didn't realize it was such an open process. So I think like getting that right communication, saying, look, there's a bottom up process to gather community needs. And then we're going to try to stabilize that in a few expert panels that are as representative as possible. And if it doesn't make the cut, don't stop the work. Figure out how to link your local concern to the, let's say, community-wide EAV. So there's like a strategic process in the formulation that I think could be useful.
That does seem like a good model, and certainly the question of how expert panels would be would be an important one.
Having this food security working group theme is that, remote meetings can to some extent work fairly well. So as much as, with our inability to meet in person with a lot of the remote communities, think about technologies like this that might work. And I don't know, Hayo, you might have attended more of the food security working group if they prefer also having options to just call in without a Zoom thing. But just in terms of how do we get these conversations going, leveraging technology, but also being understanding of potentially other ways to communicate with people in the Arctic, especially with the travel restrictions that we're facing right now. I know in the Alaska Forum on the Environment, most of the feedback we got from people in communities is that even people that attend these larger gatherings and hubs in Alaska we're still missing a core group of voices by not going to communities and talking with people. I think that coming up with a strategy for roads that allows us to think of ways beyond our current communication strategies to reach out with folks is helpful.
Thanks, Olivia. I think that's a really good point, that all of this development that we're talking about requires a massive amount of communication. I think it'll be interesting to see the feedback from this meeting and kind of the structures that we've built in to this iteration of the AOS and ASSW to see how things are playing out at this scale. I know we're certainly not the only meeting that's gone online recently. It'll be interesting to see how the technology and kind of the culture around it evolves. Kat, you have your hand up?
Yeah, one of the things that was brought up yesterday was that, you know, those of us that are attending this conference remotely, even by phone, are very privileged in the fact that we can attend it. So I think that was definitely a point that was made, that while yes, maybe switching to phone conversations and maybe not WebEx would be one way to access more of the communities there, that even that may limit the number of people that we can talk to, because some of them don't even have phone service or anything like that to connect to. I think the main thing that I took away from the breakout group that I had yesterday in the food security was, and I know this is slightly off topic, but that their biggest complaint was seemed so on a political and management type level, in that, and I can kind of understand this coming from a national lab. I'm at the Los Alamos National Lab, in that those things that, you know, that those variables, those things that the studies that we do as scientists and things that we care about don't necessarily get translated up to upper levels, and they don't get translated to policy. But the local communities, that's what they see. They see policy. And so I don't know if there's a way that we can penetrate up into a, you know, higher management or policies and things like that, that through these observing platforms and these recommendations, such that the things that we care about and the things that the communities care about get connected. Because at the moment, it seems like there's a big management issue in the middle that kind of disconnects the two, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So we have just a few minutes left of this session. So I want to very briefly go through and talk about what we're planning for day 2. So we're having 2, or actually 3 different types of sessions tomorrow. So we have a second session that's happening twice, once first thing on the agenda and once later in the day, focusing on linking societal benefit areas to potential essential Arctic variables, with the question of how do we evaluate what is an essential Arctic variable, and then combining that with an exercise in defining requirements and observing needs for these areas. The second type of session tomorrow is going to be a one-off. It's a cross-cutting section in which it's only, I think, working groups 1 and 4 that are meeting. This is going to be focusing on issues that have arisen during the Arctic Observing Summit and addressing those in discussion, followed by an activity that's looking at workflows and how we can feed that information into a larger system. And then the last thing that we have on day 2 is going to be starting to consolidate these recommendations into a statement. So we'll have a session starting that process kind of late on day 2, and then a second iteration of it the next day on day 3. So that's what's coming up for the activities for tomorrow. I recommend that you look at the agenda document and the links to the discussion templates off of that. Olivia, would you mind copying the link to the agenda into the chat box? But so I've pulled up the kind of main sessions for tomorrow here, where the focus is really going to be around these questions of how do you evaluate what should be an essential Arctic variable, and then the societal benefit area and requirement exercises. So if you can, if you have a few minutes, please look at the essential Arctic, or the discussion template for that before the session tomorrow. You're certainly welcome to participate if you're seeing it fresh, but I think it'll be a more fruitful discussion if people have thought about it for a few minutes before they join these discussions. With that, does anybody else from Working Group 1 want to add anything? Sorry, I've got a jingly dog in the background. I would just add to this that there's a panel this afternoon, and then I recommend that we break up into or attend some of the other working group meetings happening later today, where there's some cross-cutting sessions hosted by, I think it's working groups 2, 3, and 5.
Yeah, actually, Alice, if I can just chime in for the cross-cutting working group meetings set up for tomorrow. So those are 1430 to 1600 UTC. It would be good if people affiliated, you know, if each working group, so right now here we have a number of people from Working Group 4 and Working Group 1, if you can just internally make sure that you have emissaries or connectors in either one of the other cross-cutting sessions, that'll make those a bit more productive.
Yes, thank you. And the agenda for the next several days is in the chat box at this point. So unless anyone has anything last things they want to say, I guess we can wrap up 3 minutes early. And I look forward to talking to you guys all again at the next sessions.
Great. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.